Don't you worry about it. She's just trying to book a flight.
Yeah, which I should probably be getting to.
Yeah. All right. The biomolecules of life. Well, there are 4 categories of them. And we're going to go through each of them very briefly in a biochemistry class. But I'm just going to talk about it. The 3 of them, the 4 of them are proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic. And I should have phosphorus. I have the elements that each of them. And actually, I have phosphorus in DNA, but actually the largest amount of phosphorus happens in lipids. So again, what did I do in class today? I watched my professor make PowerPoint slides. There you go. So let's walk through them a little bit, shall we? First, what are biopolymers? Well, a polymer is simply a chain made up of individual links of some sort or subunits of some kind of, in this case, chemical. And those subunits are what we call monomers. Monomers. Mono meaning one, poly meaning many. So biopolymers are the 4 categories that I showed you previously. Categories are carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acid. And when we think about the polymers, a polymer of a carbohydrate, some sort of polysaccharide. The polymer within the category of lipids is sort of ambiguously termed fat. There are different categories. The main one that we're going to talk about are triglycerides. And proteins are called polypeptides. The polymer is a polypeptide. And in nucleic acid, the polymers are DNA and RNA. Each of these, we have monosaccharides, fatty acids, amino acids, and peptides. Well, this is again. Let's start with protein. So, proteins are made of amino acids. And the general structure of an amino acid has a carbon backbone attached to an amine group. Refers to nitrogen. An amine group is. It's called an acid, an amino acid, because this group over here is called a carboxylic acid. Now, what did I tell you acids were the other day? What's that? Yep, H. What? Hydrogen. They are hydrogen ion donors, a proton donor. It's something that wants to give away or release its proton. So this thing right here is an acid because this proton right here is particularly acidic. And this species is in equilibrium with something that looks like this. So the proton will come off like this, and it will leave us something that looks like that. So this oxygen is negatively charged, and the hydrogen is positively charged. This is stable. This is able to occur because it's in equilibrium with this. Right? So both of these oxygens can share that negative charge. This double bond is not short and this one long. These 2 CO bonds are like 1.5 bonds each. They're like the length is sort of in between a single. So the 2 oxygens are able to share that negative charge. They're they're able to share the negative charge when the acid ionizes. So amino acids are able to form this interesting species called a zwitter. Zwitter ion has an overall neutral charge. It's basically when an amino acid takes that proton and donates it to the amino group. All right, it ionizes itself. So we have a negative charge over here and a positive charge on this. Okay, this Zwitter ion is zwei from the German two, eins, zwei. It's a doubly ionic species where the overall charge is 0. I'm telling you that because these Zwitter ions can then form like Lego blocks. They can add on to it. So nitrogen on one amino acid can then form a bond, a peptide bond, to the carboxylate group of adjacent long chains that end up, okay, long chain of peptide carboxylate. So then you see here this R group that's attached to what we call the alpha carbon in the middle. That R group just has that R stands for rest of the molecule. There's some other thing there, and in fact, the biologically relevant amino acids, there's 20 different side chains. This isn't, again, not a biochemistry, so I'm not going to through all of those or whatever, but it is the character of these amino acid side chains that give the proteins their specific three-dimensional. It's the shape of the protein that gives the protein its function. Proteins have all kinds of functions in our body. There's a category of proteins called enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that catalyze some kind of reaction. They're going to make some chemical reaction in the body happen more quickly, more rapidly. There are structural proteins. These are proteins that, so for example, collagen. We talked about collagen in the lab. That's a structural protein. It's a protein that doesn't catalyze anything. It just gives some kind of mechanical support to proteins are sort of the workhorses of the body. They serve a wide variety of things. And then the foods that we eat that are sources, all kinds of animal products are protein. So egg whites, actually egg yolks, but egg whites are all protein. Fish, nuts, or those there, nuts. Even plants like spinach is going to have some protein because all living cells need proteins to do what they're meant to do. Some things are higher in protein, and some things have less protein. So that's the short story on proteins. Any questions? I'll go deeper if you want. Next are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are something that are near and dear to my heart, not just because I used to shed my. I studied carbohydrates in graduate school, and can tell you a lot of interesting things about them. One of the things that people don't really appreciate about carbohydrates is that they are the evolutionarily most ancient of the biomolecules. They were the first biomolecules to appear on Earth. Glyceraldehyde, the first. Sprung. So carbohydrates is the name of the category of biomolecule, but the monomers are what we call simple sugar. Simple. And these can be mono or disaccharides. Typically it refers to monosaccharides. And those can build up by forming what are called glycosidic bonds, the chemical details of which we're not going to. But here are some examples of some simple sugars. So here is N-acetylglucosamine. That's this. So N-acetylglucosamine is this molecule, except with this right. But this is, in fact, glucose. Glucose is the fundamental sugar that our body uses in its blood. And we take glucose, build it up into long chains. So these little beads on this crazy octopus here is a glucose molecule. This is what glycogen. The core of glycogen is protein, structural protein called glycogenin. And glycogen, the whole molecule, is another word for it is animal starch. You can think of it as animal starch. In plants, the starch is called amylose. All right, and we'll talk about amylose. Are we going to talk about amylose? No, I don't. We probably won't. But amylose is the starch that you find, like potatoes, like that. It has a very similar structure to glycogen. N-acetylglucosamine, we will talk about a little bit more later in our connective tissue chapter, because it and other related sugars are important in the formation of a lot of connective tissue, particularly. So you've heard maybe people who have like bad knees, their cartilage is going bad, they're told to eat N-acetylglucosamine, or high hyaluronic acid, maybe, whatever, those kinds of weird sounding. They are important. So, glycogen is how we store sugar for usage in our body, and it's stored in only two places in the body. It's stored in only two places. It's stored in every single muscle cell in your body, which is why you see all those muscles there. And it's stored there for usage in body movement. And then the only other source of glycogen storage in the body is the liver. And that glycogen is there to keep our blood sugar stable for our brains and the other organs, blood sugar. So glycogen stores itself in the liver and the muscles. Carbohydrates come from all over in the diet. Obviously, pastas and fruits and vegetables. Lots of carbohydrates, as will grains. It's really hard to find food that's not going to have any carbohydrate whatsoever, but things like meat are going to have very low levels. Is there anything else I want to say about this? All right, fats. So fatty acids are the fundamental unit of a lipid. And the name suggests that there is an acid in there. And in fact, there is. There's another one of these carboxylic acids. So here's the carboxylic acid. And it's an acid because this hydrogen is willing to jump ship that this molecule can. So this is the acid part of the fatty acid, the fat part. Basically just a long carbon chain of repeating CH units attached to subsequent CH units, ending in CH3. So from fatty acids, we're able to make triglycerides. And a triglyceride is essentially three fatty acids attached to a glycerol molecule. This is what glycerol. I've got three carbon chain, and alcohol attached to it. The trialcohol. we have what's called a dehydration. The acid up here reacts with the alcohol. So carboxylic acid and alcohol are able to react. We have 3 of these esters. This is what we call it. You've probably heard the term triglyceride before, maybe. Heard people talk about their blood lipids, the fats in their blood. So what I'm showing you seems like, well, why do we call this triglyceride? What specific name it does, but these triglycerides, these fatty acids that are here, can vary amongst a triglyceride. Length can have different the carbon chain, and that's going to be the identity of the fatty acid. It can have a different degree of what's called saturation or unsaturation. Saturated fat is one in which all of those carbon-carbon bonds are single bonds, and an unsaturated fat is where you begin to have some double bonds. This affects whether the lipid is a fat, which is solid at room temperature, oil, is liquid at room temperature, and they derive from all kinds of different. There's all the host of different nut and seed oils, canola, etc., fats that you may get from like butter or various animal products, whatever. All of those are going to have different types of fatty acids in the triglycerides that you're consuming. So that's a triglyceride. Now, so how does this relate to us? A triglyceride can combine with a phosphate group. Where, so this is from phosphorus, an oxidized anion of phosphorus, where the phosphorus can displace one of these fatty acids so that we have what's called a phosphoglyceride. And a phosphoglyceride is basically a diglyceride. It's got 2 fatty acids. In that third position, by a So phosphoglycerides are really important because they are the molecule that forms the lipid bilayer that makes up all of our cells. So the membrane on the outside of every cell in your body is essentially made up of phosphoglycerides. All right, so there's this strong negative charge. Let's imagine what the surface of our cells look like. The surface of the cell has all of these greasy tails in on the 2 layers of the cell membrane. Non-polar, they don't want to be near water, so they hide themselves away from it. And then there are these polar phosphate, negative charged phosphate on the outside of. So there's really negative charge shield on the outside 2 layers of the inner and outer membrane of a cell. That's going to become important when we talk about how like muscles work and nerves work. We'll get to that in a little bit. Phosphoglycerides. Any questions on that one? I'm not expecting you to draw this. Freak out. There. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So up until this point, we haven't really covered a bunch of like actual science. So we've only been in the last like lecture or 2 here. And so I'm looking for you, particularly in this stuff, this background, to just get the takeaway message from this as we cover the background. As we get into more detailed discussion of some things, there'll be maybe more detailed. But so for example here, what's the takeaway? The takeaway is that fatty acids make triglycerides, which then phosphoglycerides of the cells. That's the takeaway. Does that make sense? Any other questions? All right. So nucleosides. Again, I'm showing it to you so you can see it and maybe form an image, get the like general concept in your head. I'm not expecting you to draw this molecule, but so the nucleosides and then nucleotides are what we use to make DNA. DNA is the genetic code, right? That's what we use to code information, genes. So there are a number of parts to a nucleotide. The first is the base, and there are in DNA 4 bases and in RNA 4 bases. So adenine and guanine are in both RNA and DNA. Cytosine, and then uracil is in RNA and thymine. No, do I? No, I do have it. And thymine. So the base is then bonded via a glycosidic bond to another sugar. So right away, you can see that carbohydrates had to precede RNA to evolve carbohydrates. It's ribose, it's a type of fiber. Then the ribose is attached to a phosphate. And this nucleotide is the fundamental unit of DNA. We can add more phosphate groups to this, however, and get a nucleoside diphosphate or nucleoside triphosphate. And if this base, for example, was adenine, this would be called adenosine triphosphate, otherwise known as ATP. ATP is sort of like if glucose is a $100 bill, ATP is like 20 or the $5 bill or something like that of the exchange. It's actually the unit that single reaction, the energy unit that single reactions happen. Whereas you burn a glucose and you can buy lunch and you can buy an umbrella for the rain and I don't know, but multiple things. Whereas burning a single ATP is going to give you pretty much one reaction. And the energy comes from just breaking one of these phosphodiester bonds. So this liberating a pyrophosphate. So if we had ATP and we wanted to use some energy for a reaction, we could cleave this phosphate group off of there and it would give us a DP, a diphosphate phosphoryl group there. So is there anything else on this slide? You guys get it? So the takeaway here is that nucleosides get phosphorylated, get phosphate added onto them, and they can go on to make DNA, or if you have a triphosphate that is adenosine, that can end in the cell. All right, so then once we have all of these nucleotides, they can form a chain along the phosphate and the ribose. Just like in amino acids, where we had these linkages between the adjacent. This happens between adjacent. We have a phosphate, ribose, on down. What's interesting here is that these bases, like in the amino acids, the R group, these bases they're almost like a lock and key, where they're able to hydrogen bond to a different base, a complementary base. So guanine likes to hydrogen bond to cytosine, like this. And adenine bond to thymine, like so. when you get a whole strand of these, there's going to be a complementary set on the other side of it. And this double-stranded structure, because of the architecture of this backbone, forms a helix or a big spiral. These spirals are what form your genes. The genes are what get decoded, transcribed, and then translated protein. Again, we're not going to go through that in depth. Add that. Any questions? Okay. Here's a fun story. I've been pointing out phosphorus a lot, and I might as well start with it because this is just about the discovery of phosphorus and how it was first shown to be an important part of humans' biomolecules. It was discovered by this guy named Hennig Brandt. He was an alchemist who was searching for the Philosopher's Stone. Does anyone know what the Philosopher's Stone is? You guys, probably some of you have read Harry Potter before. What is the Philosopher's Stone? Yeah, it's the stone that truly they believed would keep you alive forever and would also be able to turn lead into gold, which was the principal pursuit of what are called alchemists. These like proto-chemists, not really chemists, not actually scientific, but they were messing around with chemicals back in the day. Well, anyways, this guy here, Hennig Brandt, was a uroscopist, based in the tradition of Hippocrates. I told you Hippocrates was the Greek guy that came up with the Hippocratic Oath, and he was the dude that invented uroscopy. This is the process whereby you have somebody pee in a jar, and you hold it up to the light, you look at it, you see how many bubbles, you smell it, take a little drink, whatever you got to do to be able, it's true, they did, to be able to diagnose disease. And he was one of these fellas, right? He was a uroscopist. So Hennig Brandt, I don't know, looks like 80 years.
Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty long. Maybe he succeeded. Well, he did, I guess, sort of. He's like the closest thing to actually having succeeded finding the Philosopher's Stone. So what he did was he was like, uroscopy was how he was making his living, but he was determined to find the Philosopher's Stone on the side. All right. So he needed a lab. And to build a lab, he needed some money. And what did he do? He married a rich, he was a gold digger. He married a rich elderly woman, and she quickly died. And then he did it again. He did this twice in a row. He married and outlived two rich older women, and took their money and built this lab in his basement, along with his sons-in-law or whatever they would be. Yeah, he inherited these two sons. And so he has this lab, and now he's ready to figure it out. So he sent his sons out into the bars of Germany. Or no, I guess this guy was Dutch, out into the bars of Amsterdam or wherever. And he brought back 1,500 gallons of urine. 1,500 gallons of urine. So that is like this room full of urine, like a swimming pool of urine. And he had it in his basement, and he let it fester for a year and a half. He let this huge pool of urine just like ferment in his basement for a year and a half, and I cannot imagine what his sons thought of that. But they would go to these bars, right, and look at all these drunken people to like, because he was looking for like dark urine, right? So like, right, yeah. So lots of beer piss. And so then he took this good large quantity of new made urine of beer drinkers, and he let it ferment, and then he boiled it down until he got it to the consistency of honey. Yeah. And he continued to boil this stuff down until it was like this super thick thing, and then he heated it up really hot, and he started basically burning off all the organic compounds is what he was. Eventually, at the very end of it, the only thing that he wasn't able to burn off was the phosphorus. And what got left behind from this like vast pool of fetid urine was a little white ball of glowing phosphorus, glowing white phosphorus. And he was sure that he had gotten the philosopher's stone at that point, putting the P in phosphorus. Anyways, he wasn't ever able to take the phosphorus and turn it into gold, but he did sell his technique to somebody, and again, no one ever was able to make lead into gold, but they did use it to make matches like that, and explosives. Initially, yeah, urine. Probably, yeah. I'm sure people have done all kinds of stuff with. Ugh. Well, urine is sterile, supposedly, when it first emerges. I mean, it's a pretty. I don't know. I've never. Yes, it is. It's body temperature. It's not that. It's just that the inside of your body is sterile. So body temperature doesn't sterilize things.
No.
For sure, yeah, it's body temperature. Anyway, I don't recommend brushing it. Anyways, I don't know. It's just a weird story about phosphorus and how they discovered it. Okay, so in terms of food, what the yogic tradition talks about, what says about food, is contained within the discipline of Ayurveda. And I'm sure many of you have heard this talk about some aspects of Ayurveda more later in the semester, but today I'll just point. They think about it a little bit differently than we do. We separate our nutrition into the molecular categories: protein, fat, and carbohydrate. They think about it a little bit differently, but there are overlaps in the way that you. So, in Ayurvedic thought, there is, to begin with, tamasic. And tamasic foods are ones that spring from impulse, need, or instinct. So they have these different emotions that are associated: dull, angry, confused, impulsive. These are tamasic foods that inspire or are inspired by these foods. And what are they? So they think meat and fish and eggs, alcohol, intoxicating drugs, anything deep fried or kind of highly produced, highly processed foods, sweets, yeah, any of that kind of stuff. So all the like American diet is basically tamasic, to be avoided if possible, or to, when I have tamasic foods, have them in extreme. Then next up, this sort of hierarchy of virtue. So the way that I'm showing a pyramid here. Don't get that confused with the food pyramid that we have in America. The food pyramid, the idea is that most of the food on the bottom would be like your grains or whatever, and that's what most of the food in your diet is supposed to be. Here, this is sort of a hierarchy of Rajasic foods are ones that are fiery. So these are foods that are very stimulating, and so they embody attributes of active and positivity, activity being demanding and headstrong, etc. So Rajasic foods would be things that have a lot of ginger in them, maybe, or a lot of cayenne, spicy foods, also sweets, coffee, etc. Those sorts of things, things that encourage forcefulness and the ego. And then the highest of the foods in this Ayurvedic hierarchy is sattvic foods. And they are characterized by the clarity and lightness. So, representing gracefulness and peacefulness, disciplined attitude, the intuitive sense, person being very sensitive. So, in this category lie the majority of fruits and vegetables. They say sun foods and ground foods. When you say sun foods, these mean foods that grow, that like to be in the air. In fact, one thing that's not included on this little pyramid here, mushrooms are actually considered to be tamasic by Ayurveda because they grow in dark. It's in decay. So that's sort of counter food on this hierarchy, this spectrum. But everything else is kind of intuitive, as you may expect. All right. Let's move on. The next step, I probably am not going to get a chance to completely finish this before the end of the day, but I'll try. So we're walking up this hierarchy. A couple lectures started. Talked about atoms, moved on to biomolecules and macro. We will take a tour through cells, and that's going to be the next unit, PowerPoint series that I talk about. We'll talk about cellular level, tissue level, and then we're going to explore the. So I'm going to just give you an overview of those organ systems now. We'll see where that takes. First is the integumentary system. So the integument, that's the skin that covers our body. It included in this is the hair and the sweat glands of our body, our nails. The majority of the skin is there to protect us against what's can be hazardous in the outside world. Regulate our body temperature as well. There's subcutaneous fat that's part of the integument, and it's going to help us gather information about the outside sensory. It is by far the largest and weightiest of the organ systems in the body, although so the integument start. Next is the skeletal system, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the skeletal system. The principal organs of the skeletal system are the bones, the cartilages, but there are a number of ligaments that are associated with it, and the bone marrow that's found inside the skeleton, the bones of the skeleton, is also a really important part of the skeletal system. So, of course, It's going to provide support and protection for the other tissues of the body. So, for example, the brain case protects the brain. Rib cage protects the heart and the lungs. But it also serves as a storehouse for calcium. The vast majority of calcium resides in the skeleton. I told you yesterday, or whatever, Tuesday, that calcium was the fifth most abundant element in the body, behind carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And about like 99% of that is in your skeleton. So most of it's in the skeleton. Pardon me, yeah. I've been like holding this head cold at bay. The bone marrow helps to form blood cells. The red bone marrow. We talk about. And the muscular system. Also going to spend quite a bit of time talking about musculoskeletal function. So the muscular system is only made up of skeletal muscles. No cardiac muscle, no smooth muscle. The muscular system is simply the skeletal muscles, and then, of course, the connective tissue that's associated, which make up the various tendons. It serves to move the body around, of course, obviously, but it can also protect, support other parts of the body. So, for example, we have the rib cage to protect our heart and lungs, but what's protecting our guts? It's the rectus abdominis, the transverse, the obliques. So it can protect and support other tissues. So protection, for example, what protects your eye? Well, it's the orbicularis oculi. Close your eyes. It seals off the eye. Importantly, it generates heat that helps us to maintain our body temperature. I'm going to eventually talk about the concept of homeostasis at the end of this slideshow, which probably won't get to today. But yeah, the muscles play a big role in that. We've all experienced being outside someplace and it's really cold and starting to shiver. That's our body starting to move those muscles to generate metabolic heat. All right, nervous system. These are just overviews. I'm going to go into each of them in more depth as we need throughout the semester. So what's the nervous system made up of? Well, of course, your brain. The central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. And then there's the peripheral nervous system, made up of your peripheral nerves and the sense organs, the sensory organs, touch receptors, taste buds, the hair cells in your ear. All right. The principal job of the nervous system is to have rapid, long distance, and targeted response to some sort of stimuli. All right. So it's rapid, immediate, electrically based communication. It's going to help coordinate the activities of a number of, in fact, all of the other organ systems. Its job is also to gather and interpret information from the outside world so that it can execute this coordination. The nervous system is the part of our bodies that makes us aware. In a lot of ways, you can think of the body as this super complex spacesuit for this giant gray worm that is our nervous systems that's inside of it. So there we are. We are actually giant gray worms riding around in these fleshy spacesuits. All right. Anything more on that? No? Okay. Let's compare that to the endocrine system. And we will talk about the endocrine system as well. So I'm not going to really go into the integument much, but these other four systems, skeleton, muscle, nervous system, and endocrine, I'm definitely. The endocrine system is pretty abstract compared to the other organ systems. It's made of this the range of organs that are not spatially connected at all. Right? The nervous system's easy because everything's connected, or the skeleton, the knee bone's connected to the thigh bone. But the endocrine system, they're everywhere. Well, we'll understand why in a moment. What makes up the endocrine system? Well, we've got the pituitary gland, which lives in the middle of your brain. There's the thyroid gland, which lives right here by your voice box. There's the pancreas, you see right here. Pancreas lives by the stomach. We have the suprarenal gland. They live above kidneys. They live above your kidneys. There are the testes and ovaries. And there are actually a bunch of other endocrine tissues found in other systems. So, for example, the kidneys themselves have something called the juxtaglomerular complex, which you are happy to know that we're not going to talk about. And fat tissue in your body also has an. So, what are these functions? Well, it directs long-term in the activity of the organ systems. We said that the nervous system is rapid, short-term changes. It's going to direct these long-term changes in other organ systems. Well, how does it do that? It's all chemicals and hormones. This is the chemical communication system. All right? All of these organs are going to make some kind of chemical factor, some sort of hormone or protein or cytokine, whatever the word you're using in that context, some kind of chemical that is going to go into the bloodstream and cause a change in some other tissue. All right? So it can do a number of different things. A few of them are adjusting the metabolic activity that the cells in your body have. So how rapidly do you use energy in the body? It can control growth and development. It does control growth and development, structural and functional changes that happen throughout your life. The endocrine system is really complex, and like a full discussion of the endocrine system would be like a graduate level course. And we're not even going to barely scratch the surface of the endocrine system, but I'm going to tell you a few things about it so that we can understand some of the important ways that yoga and meditation affects the endocrine functioning of the body. It's the ways are numerous. And we'll get a little bit of a taste of it. Cardiovascular system is the heart, blood, and blood vessel. And a lot of attention gets paid to the cardiovascular system because it's an organ system that, particularly given the tamasic diet of the Western world, tends to go off the rails. People have a lot of clotted arteries and a lot of problems with their cardiovascular. Really, it's a pretty humble system. The entire job of the cardiovascular system is to simply, for the heart, is the pump that pushes the blood around the body through the vessels. And that blood is the way in which we distribute oxygen and nutrients and move wastes away from the cells that our body requires. So, distributes blood cells, water, dissolved materials, nutrients, waste, oxygen. Oh, and brings carbon dioxide, right? Brings carbon dioxide from the cells of our body to the lungs so that we can blow the carbon dioxide. It's also a little bit more nuanced view of the function of the cardiovascular system is in body temperature regulation. So depending upon what blood vessels contract and which ones expand or dilate, we can distribute blood to our core or to the periphery to change, as needed, heat radiation or heat conservation, and also targeting blood to tissue dependent. Cardiovascular system is certainly something that is strongly influenced by yoga and various mindful practices, mind-body techniques. So we'll talk about a number of those effects. Progress. The lymphoid system, the lymphatic system. Probably not going to talk about the lymphatic system too much, but a little bit, because it absolutely is impacted by yoga and by a number of physical activities. Physical activity definitely affects the lymphatic system. So what is it, first of all? It's made up of the principal organ of it, spleen, the thymus. The spleen is still there in all of you. The thymus, at this point in your lives, your thymus is pretty, most of you are done growing. By the time your body is through growing in volume, your thymus really begins to atrophy, and by the time you're an adult, there's not much. Its most important job is in actually just the first week to 10 days of life. There's a story that I'm not going to tell now. Maybe I'll tell. But it is interesting. It's also, the lymphoid system is also made up of lymphatic vessels, lymph nodes, also the tonsils, which are specialized lymph nodes or lymphatic tissue. Yeah. So, yes, ma'am. That's a kind of a complicated question, actually, I guess. But I guess the easy answer is not much. I mean, usually if it has been appropriately applied, the procedure will hopefully make your life better. A lot of people have tonsils that become hypertrophic, just enlarged, and they can become not just enlarged, but they can become sort of colonized by bacteria that can lead to like recurrent strep throat, for example. Yeah. Well, and your throat got better. Yeah, it did. So, getting your tonsils out is not necessarily a bad thing, but yes, ma'am.
Isn't it more?
Yes, it becomes more complicated because the blood supply into them gets bigger, and there's more of a chance of hemorrhaging, bleeding, but it can still happen. I mean, particularly if the threat caused by having enlarged tonsils is greater than the risk of having them removed, then maybe it's a good idea. That is obviously something that needs to be determined case by case by a trained professional. But as to why we humans have this problem with tonsils, I could only speculate as to that. Why is there an increase in allergy and asthma in modern life? Why do people have problems with tonsils? But I'm not. Spleen, thymus, lymphatic vessels. Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting about this is sort of like anticipating any statements I might make about yoga and the effect on the lymphoid system, is to point out that the lymphatic system is this parallel system of tubes in your body. I just showed you right here, right? There's all this fluid superhighway, all this plumbing that we have. Why do we have a completely separate second set of tubes running throughout the body? And then how does stuff get around in there? Well, it's a separate set for a number of reasons. One of the things is all the white blood cells are there. The pathogens get transferred through the lymphatic system. And it's also how we transport fat in the body, believe it or not. The fat that we absorb through the gut is not water soluble, and it gets transferred through the lymphatic system. It's not driven by the heart. It's driven by a couple of things. First of which is the motion of the body. So when you move your body, when you flex your joints, you'll notice that these lymph nodes are mostly accumulated in places of flexion, like joints in your body. So the body squeezes on those lymphatic nodes, the lymph nodes, and sort of pushes the fluid on down the line. This is why people who get, one of the reasons people that are bed-bound sometimes have a harder time clearing fluid and recovering. Motion is good. A little bit of motion is good to get the fluids moving in your body, in the lymphatic system. There's also a passive system where the blood, they run parallel to the blood system, the circulatory system, and that can help move stuff along. All right. Let's see. I got a minute or two here. Let's see if I can flash through the last couple. Respiratory system. This is the breathing apparatus in your nose and pharynx, and then the lungs. We'll talk a little bit about gas exchange, but more about the mechanics of breathing later in the semester. The digestive system. What am I going to talk about here? I may not actually cover a whole lot about the digestive system, except to talk a little bit about the intestines and various yogic practices. Urinary system, again, not one that is going to feature prominently in our discussion of yoga, nor the male or female reproductive. Okay, so that's that. We'll pick up next time with this guy here, Walter Cannon, and the concept of homeostasis. I covered the major organ systems there with particular focus on the ones that are going to be relevant to our discussion.